Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com that has new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. Today, this is a special video interview. It's special, it's off sequence. It's in addition to the promised new video interview every week that has something to do with David Bowie. And it is with one of my favorite returning guests, Marc Lowe. If you're not familiar with Marc, he is an educator and a musician. He's an American living in Japan. He teaches at a college level there, including a course on David Bowie. He has released multiple pieces of music, including albums and singles, original music, music inspired by Bowie, and some covers of David Bowie, which is how we originally met. And of all the guests I've had on my show that I didn't know previously, Marc and I think, communicate more offline than I do with any other guest. And some of our communications back and forth get pretty interesting. And I thought it'd be great to have him on. In the timing is in part because I think at some point I put on the blog that I was working on a show that had something to do with Bowie and Buddhism, and that show was in the works for many months, and it posted the Saturday before we're recording this, and as we speak, it's the featured video with Professor Donald Lopez from the University of Michigan. It's a great interview. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. But Marc had sent me a note saying, if you ever want to talk about Buddhism, I have a lot of things to say on that topic. And Marc has a lot of things to say on many topics, and we're going to cover several of them today. But let's start with that. Marc, so let me
Okay.
ask you two questions and then just take off. The one is,
Yeah.
I don't know if you had a chance to see the Donald Lopez interview. If
I
you
did.
did,
Oh,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. I
Okay,
left
I'm
a comment
interested
too.
in your comments on that. And then,
Yeah.
regardless of what you thought of that, you had something you wanted to say, and I'm really interested in what that was.
Yeah. No, I mean this whole thing is kind of quite interesting, right? Because as you mentioned, it's an off schedule
Yes, yeah.
kind of almost improvised, even from my end. Because actually, I literally this time had no idea what you're going to ask me, except the one thing as you mentioned was Buddhism.
Yeah.
I originally had asked you if you would like talk to me on my page about a kind of compilation slash retrospective I had done. And then we decided to just kind of do this way. And in terms, the reason I mentioned Buddhism and I said I have things to say, it was really just a general statement, because it's just in terms of my background, it's something that I haven't sort of talked about a lot on your blog or on this show with you when we discussed David Bowie. Firstly, I think if we took this isn't about Buddhism, I should probably get to the topic because I tend to go off topic, but like we talked a lot about the Outside album and the Leon sessions, and then we talked about dystopia and sort of branched out a bit in the last talk
Yeah.
because then discussing other albums and other periods and other aspects around Bowie, and Bowie, of course, being this fascinating figure who also had a lot to say, not only in his music, but in his interviews and in his art, his paintings, and in his, he, in so many ways. I had heard him referred to once many years ago when he was still alive, someone saying he's like one of the few Renaissance men who are still Renaissance men because everyone is so specialized. And of course, things have changed so much once again. I think now we're in this era of, what are we in the era of? I don't know, it's just chaos or something. But rather than going off on that tangent,
The chaos
but
is killing me.
this chaos has been killing us
Yeah.
for a long time, and certainly since at least 95 when that song came out, but and before then. But indeed, hello, Space Boy. Um, so I'm not going to talk about outside today so much, I don't think, unless it comes up again, which is fine. But Buddhism. So the reason I mentioned Buddhism is because another thing that not that I do now, I'm not currently teaching courses per se on Buddhism, but I teach courses on literature and I teach a course, and in fact, I'm in the midst of now, which I didn't tell you this, I don't think, or not specifically. I'm teaching a course on Japanese literature on Fridays this semester, which I've taught before, every fall semester. It's now the fall semester. I do a class at this one university, which is the same university I taught the dystopia, Bowie dystopia last semester. I'm not teaching that now, but I teach my regular Japanese literature in English survey course. Now, this course is not about Japanese literature and Buddhism, but the course begins with we start in the Meiji era. Okay, we're talking about 1868 or something, right? Starting the Meiji is like the period where Japan is changing from Western from how can I say this? From Westerners are starting to come in, show influence, and people were wearing kimonos, now they start wearing suits and things are changing rapidly. The culture is changing. Of course, it changes again after the war and so on. 1945, and that's a later thing. But so I start kind of in this modern literature starts in this sort of period. And the first author that I teach is this is going to be new for the Bowie page people, but Natsume Soseki or Soseki Natsumi, Haruki Murakami, one of the most famous, probably the most well-known Japanese author worldwide today, and has been for a long time, translated into the most languages. Has no, he hasn't translated Soseki, but he's been translated more than Soseki, and I think Soseki is the second most translated Japanese author or something like this. So we start with him, and we start with a series called Yumejuya, which is 10 Nights of Dreams. And in the 10 Nights of Dreams, there are a lot of Buddhist references and images and things. And I'm teaching kind of modern contemporary literature. And my major was in Kobo Abe, who is an author who died in 1993, much more contemporary, you could say, though he was, writing much earlier than that. And I don't want to go into all this too much because we want to kind of stay a little on topic with Buddhism and I think Bowie to some extent. But Buddhism, okay, when I was in graduate school, while I was studying Japanese literature, which is why I'm now able to teach those courses, or they asked me to teach this course. I mainly teach American literature courses, and I did the Bowie course, and I do other language courses, and I do news and current events courses, which we talked about the last time too, when we talked about dystopia. Um, and if we need to edit some of this out, we can, but I'm doing my best here to stay on topic. And so because I have the background in Buddhism when I was a graduate student, University of Colorado Boulder, until 2004, I graduated. MA student, I was doing Japanese literature, and the other half of things I was studying was Buddhism and Taoism, which is the ancient sort of Chinese philosophical system from which you hear things like yin and yang and kung fu movies and Bruce Lee and all that. That's like Taoist philosophy informs those things. And to get on to the topic of, indeed, I did watch the interview with Professor Lopez. Now, Professor Lopez, to ground this in, to situate everyone here, watching, including you and myself in the whole conversation, Professor Lopez is an expert not only in Buddhism on the whole, and I heard what he had to say, and of course I'm sitting there going, yes, telling the story of Buddhism and the Buddha and the historicity and all those things that he wrote about, which I haven't read his books yet, book or books. He mentioned the two books, the slimmer one and the larger history, right? He's a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. And how that applies to David Bowie, of course, and you talked about like in the early, songs like A Silly Boy Blue, and actually, the part where he goes, Chime, 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 that's Chime Rinpoche. That's where that Chime Chime is actually Chime Rinpoche.
Whose
That
name I
was something that,
mangled in the interview.
what's that? Oh, the name. Oh, yeah, well, it's
Yeah,
hard.
I
Yeah. I'm
mentioned
not,
him, but my pronunciation is awful.
well, no, I mean, I don't speak Tibetan languages either. I could
Yeah.
be off too. But anyway, right? So you have like Trungpa Rinpoche and Chime Rinpoche, and you have the Dalai Lama. Of course, we all know the Dalai Lama. I do want to talk about that interview, but I'm trying not to go too off topic and get back to my background and also to explain it because his background, Professor Lopez's background, and Bowie's early interest in Buddhism, right, was in this Tibetan Buddhism. So that indeed made sense that you would interview someone who was an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, Professor Lopez, after watching the interview, he obviously was a fan of David Bowie, which was cool. And he knew the songs and he knew, he was one of his favorite albums was Outside and Diamond Dogs. And I was like, okay, cool. So we'd have an interesting conversations, I think, too, about Buddhism and Bowie. should we have a chance to speak at some point. But anyhow, he's doing Tibetan Buddhism. Now, if we're going to talk about Buddhism, and I said I had some things to say about Buddhism and also Bowie. Bowie studied with Chime Rinpoche, who's one of these first Lama, they call them, right, lamas or monks, that come from, actually, as Professor Lopez mentioned, the history is that the Chinese came, invaded, and the Dalai Lama and his followers were chased out of Tibet. And actually, one song you didn't discuss in the interview, which I was kind of waiting for, and was surprised that neither of you mentioned, or I missed it, or it wasn't a major part. And you did lyrical analyses of various songs, such as starting with like Silly Boy Blue and, talking about the butter melting in the sun and all those things,
Yeah.
which comes from Tibetan Buddhism. And then there was After All and chords of impermanence being a basic concept in Buddhism. In Japanese, it's mujo, or the absence, mu or not, of jo, tsune, jo, which is something that is solid or permanent. So that's the Buddhism's translated from the Chinese. This gets really complicated. I'm going to go into this a little bit without confusing too much. This is where I become the professor here, huh? And get into the language and the how this worked. From Professor Lopez actually talked about this briefly when talking about the transmission of Buddhism from India through China. Actually, it goes through from China through Korea, comes to Japan in the form of Zen, and then it goes in other directions into Southeast Asia, and then it moves into Tibet through China. But then this gets real complex, huh? He talked about this to Professor Lopez, that actually there are two major, what are called vehicles of Buddhism, and one is the so-called smaller, and what is the so-called larger vehicle. And the smaller vehicle was called Hinayana, which means little vehicle, by the large vehicle people, the Maha, the great vehicle, with little bit, even the Buddhists can like be egotistical, huh? They're kind of derogatory towards those Buddhists aren't the big ones, they're the small ones. And the so-called smaller vehicle were actually the original, the Theravada or Theravadin. That's the original name for the Hinayana, Theravada. And those are like the Buddhist schools that developed moving out of India, because India basically remained primarily Hindu, Jain, and then there's the Muslims. And of course, we have all these warring, between India and Pakistan, which we're still seeing today forever, like Israel and Palestine kind of thing. I won't go into the politics, but Buddhism kind of moves out of India, where it was born, and it goes down into Southeast Asia, the Theravada, or the small vehicle, and then China, Korea, Japan, and places like this get the large vehicle. Now, the Buddhism that goes to Tibet, now I'm not an expert on this, this is his area, is, if I'm not mistaken, and if he's watching this, he can call me out and say you're wrong if I'm wrong, is like also Vajrayana, or it's a third, kind of like a third vehicle, but it's a sub branch of the Mahayana, or the greater vehicle. Now, this great vehicle, large vehicle, is like Zen in Japan.
Hmm.
Zen Buddhism is large vehicle. The difference between Zen, and Professor Lopez mentions this too, or mentioned this, and the Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet, which is this larger vehicle, is the Vajrayana is part of what would be called in Japan Mikkai, or secret teachings, because there's a kind of I don't want to say magical element, but actually he called it what he called Tantra, or Tantric Buddhism.
Yeah.
That's the word he used. Tantric Buddhism in Japan is Mikkai, and that's a separate school from Zen. It's part of the large vehicle, which we find early in China, which now it's gone, because once you get the CCP and all that, and that's
Yeah.
also the Buddha,
So
right?
let
That's
me
why
interrupt you here, Mark. I
yeah,
just I know what you're saying, but I think
go ahead.
uh
Too
it
much detail.
would be useful to, well, that's not what I was gonna say. You're using the term large vehicle, and I understand what you're saying, but I think that
Mhm.
might be useful to just explain what you mean by that term,
Oh,
large vehicle.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was planning to get there. No, and the smaller too. And it's not smaller, and that's why I said that when the so-called Mahayana um, Buddhists would call them Hinayana, or little vehicle, why they said that, and that will describe and explain what the Mahayana is. And also, I can talk a little the difference between that and Tibetan Buddhism, but also to get into David Bowie, I'm going to connect that too and give from my side the Bowie part that I want to talk to is not the Tibetan part, which was Professor Lopez's thing and his specialty, and I'm not a specialty in that, but um, so I studied kind of Japanese Buddhism and Taoism, which also influenced that, which I'll get back. So the large vehicle and the so-called smaller, the Theravadan Buddhism. The large vehicle, of course, is a branch off, if you will, a sub kind of Buddhism that became major in countries like China, Korea, and then Japan eventually, and other countries like this. Vietnam has too some Zen. Thich Nhat Hanh, very famous Zen monk, he was from Vietnam. So the large vehicle spreads into other places too. But the Theravada is like the traditional old school, if I can say, Buddhism, where the monks traditionally would wear their saffron robe kind of things are right. The saffron robes actually talked about that in Bowie's lyrics and that, right, in the Tibetans too. But the bald heads and saffron, or actually they're kind of like an orange colored robe, I think. Again, it's not my specialty in that area, but places in Southeast Asia, okay? Thailand, Cambodia, you would see today even Theravadin monks, and they with the begging bowl, right, and the bald heads and the robes. And what's the difference? What differentiates kind of the Buddhism they practice apart from the language, which the texts? Buddhism is actually very, very, very texts are very important, even though Westerners like to think that Buddhism is like a not religion. And so if you say that, are you saying there's not a text, like there's a Bible for the Bible or the Old Testament, the New Testament? Does that mean that Buddhism doesn't have texts? No, it absolutely has texts. But the language of the Theravada texts in those countries, the original older form of Buddhism, though of course it moved out of India, the idea was that the monks who were meditating, now this goes to what Professor Lopez talked about, to try to get out of this cycle. Remember, he talked about with you, he showed the Tibetan version of the cycles of life and death and rebirth.
Right.
And of course, he talked about reincarnation. You could be reborn as an animal or in the Buddhist hells and so on. Now, in the early versions of Buddhism, as I understand them, what the monks are trying to do is to escape that cycle of death and rebirth through meditation, through good deeds, through shedding bad karma, which is the bad energy that you've collected over a lifetime if you do things like eating animal flesh. That's why Buddhists are traditionally vegetarian. They don't want to kill animals and eat them because that creates bad energy or karma, which will then move off with them into the next cycle. So what they do, right? So they're vegetarian, they meditate, they bless people in the village, or they help people, not necessarily blessing them. But the thing is that when the Mahayana develops later, what they're saying about the smaller vehicle is that those Buddhist monks are meditating for themselves in order to themselves individually escape that cycle of death and rebirth. And once they escape the cycle, they don't have to be reborn again. They get nirvana, like nirvana or whatever it is. They're finished. They're done.
Yeah.
They've escaped the cycle. That's it. Now, what differentiates that from the Mahayana? And this also the Tibetan Buddhists would be part of this. The Mahayana Buddhism is that the Mahayana then extended out to say, well, once one becomes enlightened, one does not just stop there. One does just not escape the cycle of death and rebirth, but one then chooses, although one could escape it and be finished, or like in the Tibetan tradition, Professor Lopez was talking about those kind of higher beings that they haven't completely disappeared from any energy form, but they're living up in their Buddhist heavens kind of things.
Right.
Those higher
I something
energy.
I learned and I didn't fully appreciate was
Yeah.
he was saying that Buddhism has gods, not an all-powerful creator God, but it
Well, yeah,
sounded
it's
to me,
complicated.
yeah,
Yeah,
it sounded
I
to
can talk to
me,
this. I can talk to this too. And also how Bowie took this and how he, right, interpreted this is another question. But yeah, that there are, well, okay, here again, this actually also goes back to the difference between the Theravada or the small vehicle and the large vehicle, and especially Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana,
so
or
Mark, let me
this
stop you
kind.
again.
Yeah,
Tell me, just let's, in the simplest terms, what do you mean by small vehicle and large vehicle?
this is what I'm getting at.
Okay.
Small
All
vehicle,
right.
I'm trying to get to that. Yeah,
Okay.
it's complex.
Yeah.
The small vehicle, they meditate for themselves, as I was saying before, and then when they finish, they're out. They're out of the game. They're out of the cycle. They don't become like gods or anything. It's remember your talk on nothing? They become
Yes.
nothing, basically.
Yeah.
They go back to just the state of one with the universe, and they're not going to be reborn in any form, including the form of a god or an energy being or anything. They have no influence on the world except that they're part of the nothingness of the universe or the energy of the universe. That goes back to another talk about what does nothing mean. So, I'm not going to go into that whole thing. So let me explain the Mahayana,
The
okay? The
sequence
large
was
vehicle.
deliberate, by the way.
Say again?
The
Say
sequence
again?
was deliberate. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
The
no, this
sequence
was
of the
perfect.
interviews I
Oh, yeah,
wanted
yeah,
to
yeah.
have the discussion about nothing around the discussion about Buddhism.
Oh, this absolutely connects with all that and the science and the quantum physics and all of that.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that too. Although again, I'm not a scientist. It's not my thing. I'm not an expert, but indeed. So the Mahayana, the large vehicle Buddhists in Zen, for example, and in Vajrayana, which is the Tibetan Buddhism. Now, let me just say this. I haven't said this yet. Bowie's interest was in, of course, the Tibetan Buddhism, but the other interest he had was in Zen Buddhism. And this is the part where I can talk about because
Yeah.
he came to Japan and there was a Zen Buddhist priest that he used to meet and he got advice from him. And in interviews, he talks about the Zen guy who he knew in Kyoto. And I'll get back to that. So that's where I can talk about that. But in Zen or in Mahayana Buddhism and in Vajrayana in the large vehicle, including Tibetan Buddhism, the idea of, and I don't think Professor Lopez used the term, but he talked about this, the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a kind of deity. I wouldn't use the word God. Actually, I think the word deity is probably closer because in India, they have deities, and we call them gods
Right.
in English, but plural, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not God like the old man with the beard or giving the rules in Christianity. So
Yeah.
the
So
bodhisattva,
I am interrupting you. So
go ahead. I want to finish this thread, but go ahead.
go, well, I think I just want to put a marker on this that I think it's interesting. And, this appears in Bowie lyrics too, but way outside
Yeah,
of Bowie lyrics. The concept of what is a god is an under asked question because I think that in the United States, the term is usually used to imply an eternal, all powerful creator that
yes,
exists outside of time, exists outside of
yes,
space. And in other cultures, both historic and global now, that is not what
yeah.
the term even means.
Well, this gets into this is going off topic again, which I love to talk about this, but I want to finish the thread of the
Yeah, go ahead.
what is the bodhisattva, I want to say, and then
Yeah,
that will answer the question, then we can talk about what is God or what are gods in different cultures and how that right
yeah,
connects. And with Bowie and his questioning the existence of a and or some greater being, which actually and I will get back to talking about the Bodhisattva, but in the documentary Moon Age Daydream,
yeah,
there's quite a bit about, there's a whole section where there's included interview clips where he's talking about this.
yeah,
Um, and that's quite interesting to me too, his ideas about that. And they very much do jive with Buddhist ideas. And I think that's shows again his Buddhist influence, which you talked about with Professor Lopez. But the Bodhisattva, I haven't forgotten to get to the end of this, and I'm sorry it took so long. It's quite complex. The Bodhisattva is a deity or a compassionate being.
hmm,
And really, I want to say something because this does kind of go to the question about God or gods in Eastern thought. Buddhism comes from India. In India, there are all these deities. I would call them deities rather than gods. They have multiple arms, they have multiple forms.
yeah,
You know the word avatar, that people take an avatar online? It's like a
yes,
persona or like a form. It
yeah,
comes from the Sanskrit avatara, which means the god takes different forms.
right,
So we're all, you see, now this goes back to do we have ego, small ego, me, I? What is the ego? What is the person? What is the self? There's a small self and a large self. This again, Professor Lopez mentioned in Hinduism, Atman, Anatman. And he says the difference with that in Buddhism is the question of self and ego and does it exist and how does it? Okay, these get really, really complex, these philosophies. But to go very simply and talk about Mahayana large vehicle, the Bodhisattva is not only a deity or a compassionate being. I'm going to say this, it is an ideal to which a human can aspire. What marks that? I would say compassion. How is that different from the so-called small vehicle that the Mahayana Buddhists would call them the little vehicle? Why do they say you're the little and we're the big? Because the little vehicle, you're meditating for yourself and you want to become nothing, okay? You want to escape the cycle of what's called samsara, the wheel of life and death, including becoming gods and becoming this and becoming that. You just want to escape the whole thing. That's the goal. Shometsu in Japanese. You become nothing. You disappear. You evaporate almost.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
don't have to go through suffering. Going back to, again, I'm referring to Professor Lopez's talk, which you asked me to do, and because it very much relates, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, or Theravada, old style Buddhism, these concepts and terms, and they all come from Sanskrit and Hindu concepts that Buddhism adopted, but there are differences. See, we only have, this could be a 2 or 3 or 4 part talk. I mean, the Buddhism,
Yeah.
it just so deep, but I want to come back to talking about Bowie and the concept of his concept maybe of God or gods or the Western versus Eastern kind of thing. So the big difference to
So
answer this again
uh,
is
uh,
that
uh,
Bodhisattva compassion is, let me just finish this last thing to
yeah.
finish it. You choose after so-called enlightenment, rather than choosing to become nothing and escape the cycle,
Yeah.
you volunteer basically to come back, even if it means you have to suffer some more, even if it means you have more hardship, even if it means I graduated. It's like, okay, I graduated college, but now I decide to go to graduate school, and I graduated, but decide to get a PhD, and I graduated, I'm going to get a postdoc. And maybe after a postdoc, I'm going to get the next, but you could finish and just be fine. But you decide to come back to, this is the kicker in Mahayana, the great vehicle, to save all beings. What does this mean? What is the major difference? I could have answered this in one sentence, but I went off on a tangent. The Hinayana does not, they don't save all beings. They want to get out of the cycle of life and death, and they're done. They meditate to do that. When you're Mahayana Buddhist, you're a Zen Buddhist, you're a Tibetan Buddhist. The Dalai Lama is right. They believe when he dies, his reincarnation comes back and they choose the next. He's not, he dies, his body dies, but the candle flame, remember Professor
Right.
Lopez,
Yeah.
one flame goes to the next.
Yeah.
They pass the flame. The next Dalai Lama comes back, taking part of the current Dalai Lama that's going to eventually pass away and pass on the next Dalai Lama. My understanding, I'm not an expert in Tibetan Buddhism, but the idea is that the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva, the compassionate one, comes back to help everyone who's suffering, because
Yeah.
human beings are always suffering, but not only human beings, every living creature. That includes cows, dogs, pigs, cockroaches, fleas on your collar. And that's why Buddhists don't eat meat traditionally. And that's why Jains, which is another sect in India, for example, they wear like masks so that they don't breathe a bug in and kill it by accident. And they wear certain things so they don't step on them. So there's this idea. So the Mahayana, Tibetan Buddhism, Dalai Lama keeps coming back to help people, even though he graduated a long time ago, huh? And they follow him. That's in Tibetan Buddhism. But in Zen, too, you have masters who are bodhisattva ideal. They want to help others and not just meditate for themselves. That's the difference. Let's go back to your question about God and gods. I'd be glad to talk about that in
So
Bowie.
let's come back to that. But before we do, earlier you mentioned that you were expecting that Professor Lopez and I were going to talk about a song that we didn't talk about. What was that
Yeah, I
song that
didn't
you're
say.
expecting? Yeah.
It's not, because it's not about Buddhism, but it's about Tibet. What's the only
Oh,
song that you
Seven
can
Years
think
in
of?
Tibet? Yeah.
There you go. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, John's interviewing him about Buddhism, but Tibet, because this is not right. My thing is not
Yeah.
Tibet, it's Buddhism, but I'm going to talk about Buddhism in Japan and Zen. I was like, no mention of 7 years in Tibet. Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Because actually, that might go into back to the talk that we had about dystopia. and oppressive governments.
Sure. Yeah.
Are you okay? You've been shot in the
Yeah.
head.
Yeah.
I'm holding your brains. The old woman said, what is this
Right.
about? It's about the Chinese coming in and killing the Tibetans and pushing them out of Tibet. And they're still, as Professor Lopez mentioned, they're still in, I think it's Bodh Gaya in India, where the Buddha is said to be enlightened under the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment or of knowledge, the
Yeah.
Bodhi tree. Buddha means the enlightened one, the knowledgeable one, something. His name, he was a Siddhartha, he was a prince. Again, like Professor Lopez does the history of the historicity of the truth of whether we can trace him or not. But the story goes that he was a prince living in a princely castle, and Shakyamuni, clan Buddha, and the father said there was a uh, how can I say, he got like a reading from a psychic, a person who could see the future, and said to the king, the father, he's either going to become um, a great leader, a great like political leader and lead the people, or he's going to become like a religious spiritual leader. And the father's like, uh-oh, we don't want him to do that. Let's make him a politician so he can have power and money. And I don't want him to be a religious guy, my son. I'm the king. So he tried to shut out all the things so he couldn't see any of the hardships of the other people who were like in India, the untouchable class who were like starving and all the injustices. And so he gives them he shuts the palace doors, he shuts them in, and he's got like beautiful women doing dances and all the best food and drink and all the great stuff. And so he's like, this is great, isn't it? You're going to be a great king. And one day, he's let out of the palace. He wants to take a ride, and he asks the guy, his servant guy, to like show him outside the palace. And he sees these three signs. And I don't remember, maybe Professor Lopez told this story. I don't want to say it again. But
No,
the
no,
last
but
is the three
the
signs.
sort of jumping ahead because I want to get
Yeah,
to, there's a couple of things I want to talk about that weren't related to this, but you
yeah,
opened the door to talk about Bowie's idea of God and gods, and I do
yeah.
want to,
We
I
can
think
go
that's
there.
interesting.
Yeah,
I think, I'm going to tell the super short condensed version of what you were saying, and you could just correct me if I'm wrong, but then let's pivot.
yeah,
So
yeah.
before he was the Buddha, he leaves the protected palace grounds and he finds
Correct.
things that he never saw, age, disease, and he commits himself to learning the truth of the universe, and then eventually sits under a tree and he arrives at he gives up his most of his worldly possessions and discovers the path and then becomes a great teacher.
Middle path.
Um, Little path.
The middle
Okay.
path
The middle
between
path.
starvation
Yeah.
and excess. Yeah, and that
Yeah.
becomes Buddhism. Yeah.
I'm sure I butchered the story and it does it no
No,
justice
that's
to
great.
tell it in two sentences. But
That's
I,
great.
so I don't, I, we have a finite amount of time, and I think,
Yeah, you
what
go and
you've been,
let me
yeah,
respond to you because otherwise I go off on too many tangents.
okay.
Always. Always.
So we could talk, as you said, for several episodes just about the Buddha, and um, that's majority on Buddha. That's not majority on Bowie. So,
Yeah,
and that, by
that's
the way,
true.
that doesn't exist.
Yeah, not yet.
But yeah,
Not until
but
after you retire.
right. So, but we touched on, and I wasn't planning to talk about this at all.
Go ahead.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, I, Something that I've had in the back of my head that is sort of shaping up organically anyway, is through his art, and I don't pretend to know what David Bowie, the person, David Robert Jones, actually thought or believed,
Yeah.
but through his
Yeah.
art, he touches on different religious concepts, Buddhism being one of them, Christianity, Kabbalah,
Definitely.
right,
Yes.
and
Yes.
others. And I'm,
Yes.
in my head, I've got a series of shows I want to do on that. But
That's
gods,
great.
right? Gods make appearances in throughout Bowie's catalog. Um, I uh, and
God knows I'm good. God knows. I'm trying to think
well,
what's an
that's
early one.
God, right? That's singular.
Yeah, I
But he
mean that's
also
God knows
talked.
I'm good, and that can justify my actions. But of
Um,
course, it's a critique of
yeah,
this, right?
but also gods,
Those
right?
lyrics.
So like in the Superman, right? The Superman,
Well,
there's
that's
a
Nietzsche.
line.
That's Nietzsche.
Well, but Bowie also refers
But
to
that's God is dead.
gods.
Also,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, Bowie absolutely borrows the Nietzschean term of Superman, but he paints this picture of endless tragic lives, and he refers to super gods, right? And I think
Yeah.
that he's not talking about the Christian concept of God or a creator God or something like that. And he also thinks about the idea of immortality
Yeah.
as a
Well, that's
bad
all over
thing.
the man who sold the world. If we're going to take that
Absolutely.
song, because also God's a young man too, right? In um, what's the full lyric there?
The
Because
width of the
God's a young
circle.
man too,
Yeah.
with a circle. And
Yeah.
circle, by the way, the Buddhist circle, and of course we have circles and cycles in like every single religious tradition. By the way, I didn't mention this semester. Another class I'm teaching. I'm teaching everything, huh?
Yeah.
Is
So
Joseph
wait a minute.
Campbell, who was a
Just keep that thought.
mythology expert.
L- Let me just
Go
sort
ahead.
of pin sort of on the
Go ahead.
other near
I'll
on
let
the
you
other
finish.
end of his career, not the end of it, but on the song Seven, not one of his
Yeah.
better known songs. There's a
Yeah.
line the gods forgot they made me and I forgot them too.
Hmm.
Right. And again, he uses this term. He's very careful, right? He didn't say God forgot he made me. He said the gods, right? And so
Sure.
sometimes he uses the term God. He mentions Jesus. He mentions,
Yeah.
different religious concepts. But this
Yeah.
idea, I just wanted to open this up.
Yeah.
Your observation. Does he even have a consistent cosmology in
No,
throughout his lyrics? Yeah, go ahead.
no. Doesn't he say like I'm a Buddhist on Tuesday and on Wednesday I'm something else and then that's me? He himself he said and he always says in it I was not a very good Buddhist.
Yeah.
And when I was studying to be a Tibetan Buddhist, I wasn't a very good Buddhist. And then when he studied, I didn't talk yet about the Zen Buddhist guy, or like like they said, like don't become a monk. You should stay in music, but you can
Right.
contribute something because you have this perspective of impermanence,
Yeah.
for example, which I think, like you've mentioned, you often mention, I've been reading your blog and following your way of thought, your thoughts about David Bowie for quite some time. So things that I've noticed you talk about, for example, right now, like God or gods or concept of gods or cosmology. Okay. And then other words that he used, like nothing.
Right.
And so you had to talk about nothing with right. And these kinds of things.
Lawrence Krauss, the physicist. Yeah.
Right, with Krauss, the
Yeah.
physicist, right, and then
Yeah.
and Professor Lopez on Tibetan Buddhism. Now you're
Yeah.
talking to me on mishmash. I'm kind of like the Bowie mishmash. On Tuesday I'm this, and on Wednesday I'm that,
Yeah.
and that's why I've done all these things, and that's probably why I like Bowie so much. And I think if we sat down and chatted, we'd probably be chatting all day, if that had been possible, kind of thing. But I don't think he has a consistent cosmology. I think Buddhism allowed him to not have a consistent cosmology. And this is one thing about Buddhism that I haven't yet said, and I don't think Professor Lopez said it quite in this way, is that is it a religion? See, there are so many things I want to talk about, but because we don't have time and it's so complex, like I said about the texts, you can argue it's a religion because it's text and it's robes and it's rituals. But there's another side of Buddhism that Westerners have often latched onto, which is like when you talk about the concept of God or gods. Firstly, the
Yeah.
gods of Buddhism, even in Tibetan Buddhism, I would say they're deities or they're concepts of like I said, the Bodhisattva is an ideal. It's something to strive for. And in India too, these gods or deities, the reason there's so many of them, like avatara, they're different forms, different types. Even the same god can take different forms. And in Tibetan Buddhism, you have something like this too, as I understand it, because it comes kind of more from that tradition, whereas Zen does not. Zen, by the way,
Yeah.
does not have God in images. There's the Buddha, and there's a saying in Zen, this is very different from Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, you might meditate on the image of the God of the ideal, like compassion, like love, like war or violence, or how to move through that and cut through the karma of that. You have gods with knives and bloody heads. It's not all peace and flowers and roses because these are things in life. There's all
It,
kinds
it,
of philosophy that I'd
yeah.
love to talk about, but we don't have time.
One
But
one of the things I find really fascinating.
I'm still in the middle of that thread. But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, just hold the thought because this might be related. One of the
Mm.
thoughts that I find fascinating is there's a whole I don't know if genre is the right term, but there's a whole uh, ecosystem of debates between apologists, theistic apologists and atheists. And
Yeah.
the debates will often center around a very fundamental question that boils down to where did the universe come from? Where does morality come from? And the theists will often, in the abstract, argue that it has to come from an all-powerful, eternal creator deity that
That's not what
has.
Buddhism says. That's
I
not what
know,
Buddhism says.
right?
Right.
So it's what is often absent from these debates is totally different cosmologies and totally different concepts of this goes back to gods or deities or supernatural beings, right? Whatever you want to call them. But the
Right.
variety
Yeah.
of uh, you make a really great point that it's debatable whether or not Buddhism is even a religion, right?
Well, it
You're
is in the
yeah.
sense of the tradition and the text, but
Hmm.
in terms of the so-called philosophy, actually, the thing, and Professor Lopez said the same thing. I
Yeah.
want to emphasize that in Buddhism, I mean, there are Buddhist aspect to study and text and this, and there are philosophies, and there are a bazillion words written about and by Buddhists and etc. And there are all these different branch offs, but those are religions
Yeah.
if they have a temple, a church, a center, and there's money and there's people, those are religions. That's Buddhism, ISM. But the essential fundamental thing about it is this: it's experiential. You don't need texts, you don't need robes, you don't need to shave your head, you don't even need a teacher. You are
Yeah.
your own teacher. And the light, the most essential thing the Buddha said, if this is true, but he has said to have said, this is in a lyric of one of my own songs, or I've used this in several songs. Be a lamp unto yourself, or be a light unto yourself.
Hmm.
That means you don't need religious people telling you how to pray, what to do, what not to do. You ask about morality. Morality comes from that. It's not a teaching, it's not a lesson, it's not a law, it's not a rule. It's not because somebody told you this or that. Killing is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it doesn't feel right to take someone else's life or hurt them. If you cause pain to someone or something, that is a fundamental, that's not compassionate. You're not a bodhisattva. If you're trying to follow a bodhisattva ideal of compassion, if you want to save everyone from suffering in your, right, then you wouldn't do that. Not because somebody told you it was wrong or you're going to go to jail if you do it. What if you could do it and not go to jail? Does that make it right? But who says so? Well, that's something, if you have your inner light and you
Right.
find that light being a metaphor, but the Buddha is saying, what I learned, oh, my disciples who are sitting around listening to me, is simply to be a light unto yourself. You
Yeah.
don't have to follow
So
me, and you don't have to make a religion after me either. But what do people do? They like to take the words of these great teachers and make religion out of it, and
yeah.
then make a bazillion variations and make a bazillion gods for the people of the villages who need that image. But really, those gods are just metaphors, if you will, or um, ideals, like the Bodhisattva ideal in the form of Kanon, for example, Guanyin, a compassionate woman. But then again, you have fierce gods of war and all these things. It gets real complex. But those are just images. You don't need any of them. Let me say one last thing quickly and let you talk. In Tibetan Buddhism, in the Mikkyo or the Vajrayana, they do use those a lot. And so, speaking with Professor Lopez, and he showed you the wheel of life and the skeletons and the scary ones and the other gods and the this and the that. In Zen and in the Chinese, which came from Taoism, which I studied, which influenced Zen, it's really a Chinese Buddhism, as Professor Lopez mentioned that. Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit different form of Mahayana or great vehicle. Zen is very simple, right? The flavor of Zen, probably your image could be, or people watching this, right? It's like you sit and you meditate, and sometimes they have these weird riddles that they give to meditate on. And if you get it wrong, they go, stupid, go back and meditate again. Nope. Stupid, go back and meditate. Nope. There's no meditation on gods. There's no fire rituals. That stuff is the Vajrayana, or in Japan, it's called the Mikkyo, or the secretive form of Buddhism. That's very different from Zen. Zen's very dry. It's like, but What again separates it, that might be more similar, you could say, to the South Asian Theravada small vehicle, but the difference is the bodhisattva ideal. And that is the essential difference because you want to help everyone. Now, that's not to say that people in Southeast Asia, that the Buddhists don't help people. That's what they do. But the
Yeah.
concept changed.
Is morality in Buddhism, and it might be different for different branches of Buddhism, is morality objective or subjective?
Neither and both. It comes from inside you. Is that objective
So,
or subjective?
so
Well,
how is
it's
that
not
not
objective, but it's not
subjective?
subjective if it's just feels the right thing to do. It's subjective. But it's like, what's your intuition tell you? Like, is it okay to kill somebody because I don't like them? I teach literature. Okay, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. The first line is, "Why say you I'm mad? I'm not mad. You think I'm crazy?" And you get this crazy narrator, and then you realize that he killed this old man he lives with because he doesn't like his eye.
Hmm.
Most people would say he's crazy and that's
Yeah,
homicidal and pathological. You
right.
can't just do that. Why? Because it's against the law, or because we don't kill someone because we don't like the way their eye looks, or because
Well,
we don't like this, or we don't like
no,
the color
that's
of skin.
that's
So maybe we have to send them to like prison in another country.
no,
We
that
don't
that's
do that.
that's actually a great
That
paradigm
morality,
because
or
there's I think everybody would agree that objectively it doesn't matter what the person's motivation is. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter what the person's motivation is. It doesn't matter
it
what
might.
it doesn't matter what the person thinks in terms of whether or not it is right or wrong to kill the guy because he doesn't like his eye. The law applies, and it's not up to the individual to decide if the law applies. But wait a
Take the
minute, wait a
law
minute,
out of
wait a
it
minute,
for a
wait a
minute.
whole lot. So it's a
Okay.
different, so the question about whether or not it's good or bad is a different question. And, say Christians
Right.
would
Right.
say that the determinant is not society. It's like it is for law. It's not the individual. It is God, right? God has said,
No, it's
"Thou shalt
fear.
not kill." What's that?
And it's fear of hell.
Well, hell is the consequence, right? So
Unless you
it's
go to the
like,
well, if you're Catholic, you go to the confession box. But why I'm saying that is what I mean by that is, yeah, it's well, yeah, because it is fear, because I'm a God-fearing man. I
so
fear
so
God.
in
I fear
if
God's retribution if I do something wrong. But that's
right,
different essentially from the kind of Buddhist morality, if we're going to
yeah,
put an ISM or IST on it, which comes from you asked if it's subjective or objective. To go back to that, what I would say is then it's not because it's the law. There is a law, dharma.
right.
Professor Lopez said it's another word for Buddhism. Dharma also kind of means law with a capital L. There is a kind
That, by
of
the way, is what I thought the
intrinsic,
word meant. Yeah,
it's an intrinsic law that exists, but what is the compass for that? Like you say, obviously, I don't like his eyes, so I'm going to kill him. We
yeah.
can't say that's right. But at the same time, where does this law come from if it's not the law of man? Like if I
Hmm.
break the law, they're going to put me in jail or I'm going to be fined. But if it's a moral law, and that morality, is it saying it's moral because God said it in the Bible or God said it in this Buddhist text? No, in the Buddhist text, God doesn't say do this, do that, or you go to hell. There are
Yeah,
Buddhist hells in certain versions, like the Tibetan version has the Buddhist hells. Zen doesn't really focus on that because the compass is it right to kill someone because I don't like his eye? Well, no, that's not right. You're inflicting anything that inflicts suffering or pain. But if you want to get even more complex and more sticky here, you go back to Hindu ideas, which preceded Buddhism, in which some of them are similar, some of them are different. But this text, the Bhagavad Gita,
yeah,
says that your karma, Arjun, is you have to fight in this war. And Arjun says, Krishna, the god or the deity who he's talking to in this dialogue, I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill somebody. That's bad karma. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to kill somebody. And Krishna says, no, it's your duty to kill. You were born and put on this earth to do this because you're of the class that is a warrior, and your job is to do that. And it's your karma to do it. But don't do it with attachment. Don't do it with hatred. Now, I'm going to go back to what you said. We can't kill someone because we don't like them. Absolutely. We all agree on that. However, there are people who do that. But we say that's wrong, morally wrong. That's against the law. But what about, let's flip this. I don't like his eye. We all say, okay, he's crazy. You can't just kill someone you don't like his eye. But in The Telltale Heart, this is a
yeah,
fiction story.
yeah.
I'll use that. Edgar Allan Poe. Okay. So, but what about if the guy with the eye tries to attack you or your spouse or your friend or another innocent person standing next to you who's weaker than you, would it be right to try to defend that person? And in the process, if you needed to kill the other person, maybe not like with anger or enmity, to save another person who's innocent, would that then be correct? That gets sticky, right?
Well, that
We
get
have these
right.
issues of
That
like people go to court and they try to determine, did someone do it because, right?
yeah,
Was there a motivation or not?
sure.
Like in detective fiction, right?
There,
So
there's
it
st
gets
it's
sticky,
sticky on
doesn't
three
it?
levels, right? It's like,
It gets very cloudy.
is the action
Right.
illegal? That's one question. The second
Well,
question is
that's man's law though.
right.
Right?
Well, but this gets
That's not
to
Buddhist law.
it is related then to this, which is the question illegal? Is the question immoral? And then the larger question is, if you say it is immoral or it's not immoral, according to what?
And who determines morality and who
Who
determines
determines
the
it?
law?
Right. Yeah, that is an interesting question. Mark,
Is
that
it
is a
okay to
question that
knock
what's that?
down
That's a
walls of your home without asking anyone first? I mean, if you own it, if you own a white building,
yeah.
if you own the white building and it's yours, you could knock the walls down without asking anybody. But is it lawful to knock them down without asking anybody first?
I don't know why you bring that up. Um,
Neither do I. It just popped into my head out of nowhere. It's just,
so
yeah.
believe it or
So go
not,
ahead.
Mark, we are running out of time,
Out of
and
time. We should do this again. There's like a million other things to talk about here.
right
And we
there, I
probably,
had several other things unrelated to Buddhism, and
yeah,
I did want
go
to
ahead.
just as we're running out of time, I wanted to see if there were um, any threads that you wanted to tie up that don't launch their own whole conversation.
There are too many, I
Yeah,
think, to even get into. How to end this thing, huh? So yeah, I mean, I did kind of explain those differences and things, blah, 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 blah. 7 years in Tibet, right, which deals with actually the history and Bowie was interested in. And I think if we do this again, maybe let me end with this. I'd love to talk about like what some of the things that Bowie had said about these things and like to kind of like, you know, parse that out. And you asked if he had like a kind of a sort of a handle on his world. You know, he's got some Christianity here, he's got some Buddhism here, he's got some this and some that. And my last comment about that was Buddhism. I think he felt that was a key where he could open that door and leave it open and leave loose threads, exactly like we're going to do right now, just flapping in the wind.
yeah,
And let me end with this flapping in the wind. You see how my brain works. There's an old Zen koan, which is like they call them public cases. They give to
yeah,
the Zen student to meditate on. And there are these two, I'm going to end with this. This is from China, but it's in Japanese Zen. They relate this. So there are two disciples, two Buddhist monks standing there, and there's a flag. And the flag is flapping. It's windy out. And the guy says like, okay, when the flag flaps, is it the wind that flaps the flag, or is it the flag that's flapping? You know what I mean? Is it the wind or is the
yeah,
flag that flaps?
yeah,
And so they're like arguing back and forth. The one says it's the wind, because without the wind, the flag doesn't move. The other says, yeah, but it's a flag, because the flag, if it's just windy, there's no flag flapping. So the master comes by and he goes, it's not the wind that flaps the flag. It's not the flag that is flapping. It's the mind that flaps the flag. And let's end there.
all right. Mark Lowe, always interesting. And if you can't get enough of this, Mark will be back. And if you've never seen any of our previous discussions, they're pretty easy to find on the channel. Mark Lowe, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We'll talk
Thank
again
you.
soon.
Let's do it. Have a
All
great day.
right.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Peace. Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Okay.
All right.